Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show engineered to transform vast stacks of articles, research, and data into the clearest, most relevant insights for you. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the intellectual architect of, really, the modern free market movement, Milton Friedman.
We're looking at the life and the just seismic career of the Nobel laureate statistician and the leader of the Chicago School of Economics. He lived from 1912 to 2006.
And when a publication like The Economist calls you the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century, his ideas weren't just academic.
No, not at all. They were like the operating system for entire national economies. His policy blueprints, for better or for worse, really defined global political economies from the 1980s right on through today.
So our mission today is to really synthesize the core nuggets of knowledge from all the sources you've shared. We're covering his life, his really revolutionary academic theories, his often radical policy proposals, and his complex, truly global legacy.
Right. We want to go beyond the Wikipedia entry.
Exactly. We need to understand the philosophical machinery that was driving his thought.
And that means we're tracing his whole path from, a Depression-era public servant all the way to becoming the ultimate anti-Keynesian academic.
We'll get into key concepts like consumption smoothing, the permanent income hypothesis,
his famous monetary explanation of the Great Depression, the whole discipline of monetarism, and, of course, how his ideas became, well, almost gospel for leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher.
It's a massive intellectual project. So let's unhack this and start right at the beginning.
Let's do it.
Friedman's early life, it doesn't really suggest a future as this, economic revolutionary who's rubbing elbows with presidents and prime ministers.
Not at all. He was born in Brooklyn in 1912. His parents were Jewish working-class immigrants who had fled persecution in what is now Ukraine.
And the family eventually settled in Rahway, New Jersey.
Right, and this background is so crucial because it really informs his whole worldview. He had this deep belief in the power of free enterprise and education as the only real path to upward mobility.
He was a brilliant student, too. Graduated high school just before his 16th birthday.
Yeah, a prodigy. And he was the first in his family to go to university. He went to Rutgers.
And here's the key thing. He wasn't originally planning on economics?
No. His passion was mathematics, statistics. He was planning to be an actuary.
But timing, as always, is everything. He graduates right into the absolute depths of the Great Depression.
And that economic catastrophe just convinced him that, mathematics was a tool, but economics was the field where he could actually address the most profound societal issues of his time.
So he chose to pursue a Master of Arts at the University of Chicago.
Which was, even then, this crucible for anti-interventionist thought.
That experience in 1933, that must have been incredibly formative.
Oh, absolutely. He studied under these titans, people like Jacob Viner, who was an early advocate for free trade, and Frank Knight, who really emphasized skepticism of government planning.
He did his PhD at Columbia later on, in '46.
He did, but that rigorous, almost philosophical anti-interventionist methodology of the early Chicago school, that just stuck with him. It became his intellectual bedrock for life.
So before he became the world's most famous critic of government overreach, he actually he worked for the government during the New Deal. This is a chapter of his life people often forget.
They do, and it's vital context. In 1935, academic jobs were just non-existent, so he went to Washington, D.C.
And worked for the National Resources Planning Board, the NBER.
Right, and he described those job creation programs, the WPA, the CCC, the Public Works Administration. He called them a lifesaver for young, unemployed economists like himself.
So that shows a sort of, pragmatic acceptance of government action during a crisis, at least initially.
For sure. But his core principles against meddling in the market were already there, especially when it came to price controls.
Right.
So while he saw the value in, creating jobs, he strongly objected to the price and wage-fixing parts of the New Deal.
Things like the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Administration.
Exactly. He didn't see those as helping the economy. He saw them as actively destroying the essential signaling mechanisms of the market. The idea that prices and wages need to be free to adjust to allocate resources.
That's a really important thread. That opposition to price fixing, it runs straight through his entire career.
All the way up to his later opposition to the minimum wage. It's perfectly consistent.
Okay, so here's where the real irony comes in. The best anecdote in the source material, I think. During World War II, from 41 to 43, he's at the Treasury Department.
Yes, working on tax policy to fund the war effort.
And what does he do?
He helps design and implement the payroll withholding tax system.
The very system, the man who spent his life arguing against government expansion, invents the tool that allows the modern, overgrown administrative state to fund itself so easily.
It's incredible, isn't it? Before this, people were supposed to pay their income taxes in one big lump sum.
Which I'm sure led to all sorts of problems.
Oh, yeah. Non-compliance, financial distress. The withholding system made tax collection smooth, automatic, and mandatory.
He must have reflected on that later.
He did. Friedman wrote in his memoirs that his wife, Rose, would frequently remind him, with a smile, that he was the one responsible for making possible the current overgrown government we both criticize so strongly.
That's amazing. What a lesson in how a crisis like a war can create these permanent infrastructures for state power.
It's a perfect example. Political necessity just overrides philosophical principle.
So the war's over, he's got his PhD, and in 1946, he goes back to the University of Chicago.
Yes, this is the definitive moment. He takes over the prestigious chair left vacant by Jacob Viner, and this is the launch of what we now know as the modern Chicago School.
And for 30 years, he wasn't just teaching economics.
No, he was cultivating an entire intellectual ecology. It was all about methodological rigor, free market conviction, and just fierce debate.
In that environment, it produced so much talent.
A remarkable concentration of it. He mentored future Nobel laureates like Gary Becker, Robert Fogel, Robert Lucas Jr. This wasn't just a department. It was like an intellectual forge that was training the policymakers of the future.
And before we dive into his big economic theories, we should just briefly touch on his pure statistical genius. People often overlook this.
They do. During the war, he was at the Division of War Research at Columbia, and he contributed to developing something called sequential sampling.
Sequential sampling, what is that exactly?
Well, it's a brilliant example of taking a core economic idea cost-benefit analysis and applying it to a completely different problem.
Okay.
So instead of inspecting, say, a fixed number of widgets, like 100 of them, and then making a decision, sequential sampling let engineers inspect them one by one.
And they can make a decision at any point.
Exactly. Based on the cumulative data, you could decide to accept the batch, reject it, or just keep sampling. It made quality control so much more efficient.
I see. So you don't waste time inspecting all 100 if the first 10 are already showing a major problem.
Precisely. It became the standard technique for quality control in modern manufacturing. Saved immense amounts of time and resources. It just shows his intellectual breadth.
All right, so let's shift focus from the forge to the heavy artillery. The theoretical work he developed, almost all of which was designed to challenge the prevailing Keynesian orthodoxy of the post-war era.
And he started by challenging the most fundamental piece of macroeconomic modeling, consumption.
Right. In the 50s, the Keynesian model was all about how consumption changes directly with your current income.
Exactly. And that formed the basis for using fiscal policy, like temporary tax cuts, to try and fine-tune the economy.
And Friedman just threw a giant wrench into that machine with his 1957 book and the introduction of the permanent income hypothesis. Let's really unpack this. What's the difference between current income and permanent income?
It's a really profound shift in perspective. Friedman argued that consumers aren't short-sighted. They don't just look at their immediate paycheck.
So they're planning for the future.
Right. They base their spending not on their existing income, but on their permanent income, which is their long-term average expected income over their entire lifetime.
Including things like the value of their skills and education.
Exactly, their human capital. So consumption is based on the expectation of what you will earn, not just what you did earn this month.
So the permanent income hypothesis, or PIH, it distinguishes between permanent income and transitory income.
Correct. So if you get a temporary transitory income shock like a one-time government stimulus check or a sudden unexpected bonus, Friedman predicted you wouldn't just go out and radically alter your lifestyle.
Why not?
Because you know it won't last. The consumer practices what he called consumption smoothing. You want your level of consumption to stay relatively stable throughout your life, even if your income fluctuates wildly.
So you'd save most of that windfall.
You'd save or invest the vast majority of it to sustain your consumption during leaner periods, rather than just spending it all immediately.
This has huge implications for policymakers, doesn't it?
Massive. If the government tries to boost the economy with a temporary tax rebate, the PIH suggests that policy is going to be largely ineffective.
Because people will just save it.
Exactly. It casts serious doubt on the effectiveness of temporary fiscal stimulus, which is a core Keynesian tool. Friedman himself actually considered the PIH his best scientific work.
Okay, let's move to his most famous and maybe most politically charged academic contribution, his monetary explanation of the Great Depression.
This was in the seminal 1963 work, A Monetary History of the United States, which he co-authored with Anna Schwartz.
And this book didn't just analyze history, it completely rewrote the narrative of the 1930s.
It did. The traditional view was that the Depression was this inherent, inevitable failure of capitalism, and it needed massive government intervention to fix it. Friedman and Schwartz just flipped that script completely. They even renamed the period the Great Contraction.
And their core thesis was that the free market was innocent. The real culprit was government policy.
Specifically, the Federal Reserve. They marshaled just a mountain of historical evidence showing that the money supply in the U.S. plunged by a shocking one-third between 1929 and 1933.
A third. Yeah.
And they argued that the Fed, through inaction, through misguided policy, through its failure to provide liquidity during the banking panics, actively caused that contraction to spiral into a full-blown depression.
He called it a tragic failure of government.
Not a failure of the system itself. And this thesis was so persuasive, so intellectually disruptive, that it ultimately changed central banking practice around the world.
Which brings us to that incredible moment in 2002.
The famous mea culpa. The then Federal Reserve Governor Ben Bernanke, who was a scholar of the Depression himself, publicly addressed Friedman at his 90th birthday party.
And what did he say?
He basically acknowledged the debt the modern Fed owed to Friedman's work. He said, "Regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again."
That's a formal surrender of the intellectual high ground. An incredible moment.
It is. It cemented the idea that central banks have to be aggressive with monetary expansion during a crisis. We saw that in 2008. We saw it again during the COVID crisis.
But there is a nuance here, a criticism of Friedman's theory that's still debated today.
There is. And it's really important. The whole thesis rests on the assumption that the drop in the money supply was exogenous.
Meaning it was a deliberate failure of the central bank pushing the money supply down.
Right. And critics, economists like Peter Temin and later Paul Krugman, they challenged this. They argued that in a severe recession, the central bank actually loses control.
So the money supply contraction is endogenous.
Exactly. It's caused by a collapse in credit demand and just widespread fear in the banking system. Friedman saw the Fed as actively draining the water. The critics argued that the commercial banks and consumers just stopped pumping the water themselves out of fear.
And the Fed was helpless to refill the reservoir.
That's the core of the criticism. Krugman pointed to 2008, where central banks aggressively lowered rates, but credit growth was still stagnant for a while. The debate about whether the Fed could have avoided the Depression is, let's just say, it's still very much alive.
That's fascinating. Okay, so moving on. Friedman also basically defined the entire philosophical approach of the Chicago School in his 1953 essay, The Methodology of Positive Economics.
This is the epistemological rulebook. It's dense, but it's absolutely vital. Friedman argued that economics, if it's going to be a positive science concerned with what is, not what ought to be, it must be judged purely by its predictive power.
So forget about whether the assumptions are realistic.
Exactly. He argued that a theory should be judged by its predictive fruitfulness and its simplicity, not by the descriptive realism of its underlying assumptions.
So he gave the Chicago School permission to use assumptions, like perfect rationality or perfect information, even though they knew those things weren't true in the real world.
Right, because instrumentally they work. He used an analogy from physics. A physicist calculating a bullet's trajectory doesn't calculate every single air molecule it hits. They assume a vacuum or simplified drag.
The assumption is false, but the prediction is accurate enough.
Precisely. And Friedman argued the same for economics. If assuming people are perfectly rational delivers a simple model that accurately predicts market outcomes, then you should use it. Don't worry about the ingredients. Judge the cake.
That's a powerful idea. It really justifies the use of these simple, idealized free market models.
It does, even if their view of human behavior was, a bit simplified.
So this theoretical work on consumption and the Depression, it really paves the way for Friedman to lay out a complete policy system. He becomes the chief proponent of monetarism.
Right, and monetarism is essentially a revival of the quantity theory of money, a very classical idea. It basically states that the money supply is the primary determinant of inflation, and in the short run, of nominal output.
For him, economics was about controlling the money supply. Everything else was secondary.
It was, which leads to his most famous catchphrase about inflation.
Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon.
That's the one. It was a powerful, direct rejection of the prevailing orthodoxy that blamed inflation on other factors, like supply shocks.
So if the price of oil triples because of a geopolitical crisis, the Keynesians might call that cost-push inflation. What would Friedman say?
He'd argue that while a specific price, like oil, might go up, generalized, sustained inflation across all goods and services can only happen if the money supply expands to accommodate those higher prices.
So without more money in the system, a higher oil price just means people have less to spend on other things, and those other prices would have to fall.
Exactly. He used that great analogy of dropping money out of a helicopter to explain it. When you inject new money into the system, you have more cash chasing the same number of goods, and that universally raises prices.
This deep conviction that the central bank was the sole source of inflation led to his most radical proposal.
Getting rid of the Fed entirely.
Abolish the Fed.
His distrust of discretionary government power was absolute. He believed the Fed's constant attempts to fine-tune the economy, guided by human judgment and political pressure, just led to unpredictable, harmful changes in the money supply. He felt it had done more harm than good.
But wait a second, isn't abolishing the Fed and replacing it with a rigid, government-mandated computer program the ultimate form of centralized state intervention? That seems to contradict his minimal government stance.
That's a fantastic question, and it really gets to the nuance of his libertarianism. Friedman made a distinction between government action that creates a stable framework for the market, a neutral rule of law and government action that interferes with market signals.
And the key percent rule was a framework rule.
Exactly. It was designed to be a mechanism that once you set it, it just operates automatically. It eliminates human political interference and the subjective judgments that he thought caused all the volatility.
So tell us about this K% rule.
He proposed replacing the Fed with a quasi-automatic monetary policy, basically an algorithm, that would just grow the money supply at a steady, predetermined rate, maybe 4% or 5% per year, regardless of the economic cycle.
The goal being to eliminate human error and political pressure.
Completely. To make policy shocks predictable, or rather, to eliminate them entirely.
But the sources also mention an even more radical ideal he had.
They do. That was the 1930s Chicago plan for 100% reserve banking.
Which means
It would end fractional reserve banking. Commercial banks could no longer create new money by expending loans. The power of money creation would rest solely with the government.
which would make implementing the K% rule much easier.
Much easier, cleaner, more reliable. It just shows his ideal. Money creation should be mechanical, stable, and totally predictable, not a source of private profit or central bank discretion.
Beyond domestic money, Friedman was also a revolutionary thinker in international finance.
Oh, yeah. He was a very strong, very early advocate for freely floating exchange rates. He articulated this in a powerful essay back in 1953.
And at the time, fixed exchange rates were the norm.
They were linked to the dollar or gold. Friedman argued fixed rates were just another form of undesirable government intervention that inevitably led to balance of payments crises.
And floating rates were superior because they allowed for automatic adjustment.
Exactly. If a country runs a trade deficit, its currency depreciates. That automatically makes its exports cheaper and its imports more expensive, which helps correct the imbalance without painful domestic policies like jacking up interest rates or causing a recession.
And finally, we have to cover his most profound theoretical challenge to Keynesian macroeconomics, his assault on the Phillips curve.
Right. The original Phillips curve suggested there was a stable menu of options. A government could choose to accept a little more inflation in exchange for permanently lower unemployment.
A trade-off.
A trade-off. And Friedman, working at the same time as Edmund Phelps, just demolished this idea in 1968. He introduced the concept of the natural rate of unemployment.
Or NARU.
Right, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. His revolutionary insight was that it was all about expectations.
The trade-off was only temporary.
Only temporary. The government can only lower unemployment below that natural rate by using surprise inflation. You pump money into the economy, nominal wages rise, and for a moment, workers think their real wage has gone up, so they supply more labor.
But then they catch on.
They catch on. Once workers realize inflation is eroding their purchasing power, they demand higher wages. In the long run, the stimulus just makes inflation accelerate, while unemployment creeps back up to its natural rate.
And this explained the one thing Keynesian models couldn't.
Stagflation. The coexistence of high inflation and high unemployment that just plagued the 1970s. It was the ultimate vindication of Friedman's theory.
A huge intellectual victory.
It was. He proved there is no long-term trade-off. Trying to run the economy hot with inflation is like giving it a sugar rush. It works for a minute, but then the system demands more and more sugar just to maintain the same speed.
All right, so let's move from theory to application. His policy roadmap, laid out in his 1962 manifesto, Capitalism and Freedom.
A book that sold well over 500,000 copies and became the ideological touchstone for generations of classical liberals.
And this book established his vision for a radically minimal state.
He saw this direct, inseparable link between economic freedom and political freedom. For him, government intervention should be strictly limited to just the essential functions.
Protecting the nation from foreign enemies and protecting citizens from each other. So defense and the enforcement of contracts.
That's it. Everything else should be done privately. He wasn't just arguing for smaller government, he was arguing for a fundamentally re-engineered one.
Challenging basically every area of state involvement.
His critique was all about efficiency and liberty. If a service could be provided by the private sector, it should be. And the government should never prohibit private competition. He always used the postal service as his example.
And to show how consistent he was, he took aim at some pretty sacred institutions.
He did. He controversially suggested that places like Yellowstone National Park should be sold for private development.
Wow.
Now, he wasn't necessarily anti-conservation. He just believed that market mechanisms, private incentives, fee structures, the profit motive would lead to a more efficient and better maintained resource than a government bureaucracy would.
It just shows how far he was willing to take the principle.
To its logical conclusion.
Okay. Shifting to social policy. This is where he proposed the massive replacement for the entire welfare state, the negative income tax.
The NIT.
Yeah.
His most famous policy proposal for poverty alleviation. It was designed to be simple, efficient, and consistent with market incentives.
It's essentially a reverse tax.
That's a great way to put it. A single unified system. If your income falls below a certain threshold, the government sends you a cash payment.
And what were the advantages over the existing patchwork of programs like food stamps and housing subsidies?
He cited 4 big ones. First, it's directed specifically at poverty. Second, it provides help in the most useful form, which is cash, giving the individual maximum choice.
Right, not dictating what they can buy.
Third, it drastically reduces the administrative burden because it just piggybacks on the existing tax system. And fourth, and this is crucial for him, it preserves the incentive to work.
How?
Well, traditional welfare often had a 100% implicit tax rate. You earn $1, you lose $1 in benefits. The NIT would have, say, a 50% rate. You earn an extra $1, your benefit only falls by 50 cents, so you always keep half.
An extra dollar earned always means more money in your pocket.
Always. Which is philosophically central to his views on liberty.
And he justified this intervention, which is a bit unusual for him, using the idea of the neighborhood effect.
That's his ethical boundary. He accepted that government action to alleviate poverty was justified because the existence of visible poverty negatively impacts society as a whole. It distresses us, it can cause crime, so society benefits from its alleviation, which justifies a public contribution.
But he put a very strict condition on the NIT.
A vital one. He stressed that the negative income tax would only be acceptable if it replaced and abolished the entire host of existing welfare programs. He wasn't proposing an addition to the state, he was proposing a massive structural simplification.
Moving beyond economics, he was also remarkably consistent in his classical liberal principles on social issues.
His guiding star was always liberty. Take the military. He was instrumental in the committee that recommended the shift to the all-volunteer force.
He argued the draft was inconsistent with a free society.
Right. He basically compared it to slavery in its most fundamental terms.
And in education, he was the philosophical force behind the school choice movement.
His push for school vouchers was so straightforward. Funding should follow the child, not the institution. He championed the idea that public funds could be used for privately run schools to foster competition and innovation.
This led him to found what's now known as EdChoice.
It did, and he took similarly libertarian stances on personal conduct.
He supported the legalization of drugs and prostitution.
He did. On drug prohibition, he argued the government wasn't fighting drugs. It was inadvertently serving as the marketing and pricing arm for the drug cartels, making the product more profitable by outlawing competition.
He also supported gay rights.
Explicitly, he said, "I do not believe there should be any discrimination against gays."
And his views on immigration are particularly nuanced, especially when you connect them to the welfare state.
He was a strong advocate for high levels of both legal and illegal immigration. He argued it has a very positive impact on the U.S. economy because Immigrants take jobs residents are unwilling to take.
And, crucially, that they historically didn't use welfare.
Right. But that leads to his famous proviso. He argued that you cannot have open borders and a comprehensive welfare state at the same time. The incentives just don't work.
So for open borders to function, the welfare state has to be radically streamlined or ended.
That was his position.
And what about the environment? How did he apply market principles there?
Instead of rigid rules, command and control regulation, he advocated for market discipline through environmental taxes or effluent charges.
So you tax the pollution directly.
Exactly. You impose a tax on the volume and type of pollution. This provides a continuous incentive for polluters to find the cheapest, most efficient way to reduce their emissions rather than following some one-size-fits-all bureaucratic mandate.
And tying back to his earliest ideas, he was a fierce opponent of the minimum wage.
Absolutely vigorous. He saw it as government price fixing in the labor market. He argued it causes unemployment, especially among low-skilled workers, by pricing their labor out of the market. It was a perfect example of his philosophical consistency.
So his influence wasn't just academic. After he retired from Chicago in '77, he became this global economic guru.
He did. He served as a key, unofficial advisor to two of the most consequential political figures of the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher.
He provided the intellectual foundation for the deregulation, privatization, and fiscal austerity policies that really defined that decade.
And he was honored for it. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science in 1988.
But despite this close association with the Republican Party, he always identified his personal philosophy as clearly libertarian.
He did. He criticized what he called zero-government libertarianism as infeasible. He saw himself as a pragmatic revolutionary. He said he remained a Republican because that was the way he could be the most useful and have the most influence.
Now we have to talk about the most controversial example of his global reach, his connection to the Chicago Boys and the economic reforms in Chile under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet.
Yes, this requires very careful, impartial treatment. So in 1975, 2 years after the violent coup, Chile was facing hyperinflation, economic collapse.
And Friedman visits.
He does, invited by a private Chilean foundation. He gives lectures, has a private meeting with Pinochet. He was never an official employee of the regime, but his influence was undeniable.
And what was his core advice?
He advised the famous shock treatment approach to end the raging inflation. This meant extremely rapid, draconian cuts to government spending and a dramatic reduction in the money supply. He argued that gradualism was not feasible.
And graduates of the Chicago Boys, they implemented these policies.
They did.
And the controversy here is profound. He gets the Nobel Prize in 1976 amid international protests because of this association with a regime known for gross human rights abuses.
Yeah.
How did he defend himself?
His defense was consistent and twofold. First, he separated the political regime from the technical economic advice. He said he'd offer advice to any government facing the medical plague of inflation.
And the second part?
More importantly, he argued that the adoption of free market policies, despite being implemented under a dictatorship, actually led to economic success and, crucially, contributed to the eventual transition back to democracy in 1990.
So he was supporting his core idea that economic freedom fosters political freedom.
Yes. He maintained that market forces inherently decentralize economic power and undermine Pinochet's political control. Now, critics vehemently dispute this, but Friedman saw the long-term results as a vindication of his belief.
And which country did he always point to as the ideal example of his principles in action?
He repeatedly cited Hong Kong as the best real-world example of a successful free market economy.
Okay, let's pivot to the lasting critiques of his work, starting with his view on corporate philosophy. The Friedman Doctrine on corporate social responsibility.
This is still so widely debated today. Friedman argued, forcefully, that a business's only social responsibility within the bounds of law and ethics is to maximize profits for its shareholders. Period.
So he was opposed to corporations trying to do social or environmental good beyond just making a profit.
He saw it as an illegitimate use of shareholder funds. Basically, a manager diverting corporate money to a social cause was spending someone else's money on their own personal social agenda.
He called claims about CSR hypocritical window dressing.
He did, unless they were genuinely aimed at improving the firm's long-term profitability. His view was, if you want to support a cause, do it with your own money after taxes, not with the company's money.
His fundamental economic theories also faced ongoing criticism, right?
Yeah.
Especially on the nature of money.
Absolutely. We touched on this earlier, the whole exogenous versus endogenous money debate. Post-Keynesians like Nicholas Kaldor heavily challenged the monetarist view.
Arguing that money is created endogenously from within the system by commercial banks responding to demand for credit.
Right, rather than being strictly controlled by the central bank. And while Friedman often dominated the early debates, the concept of endogenous money remains a profound challenge to his strict policy rules.
And finally, we have to address the political and societal critiques that arose as Friedman-inspired policies took hold globally.
This is vital context for his legacy. The political scientist C.B. Macpherson challenged his core premise that economic freedom must precede political freedom.
But the more contemporary critiques focus squarely on the economic outcomes, specifically the rise of inequality.
Exactly. Critics like Lawrence Michel argue that the widespread adoption of the Friedman doctrine led to systematic policy choices, deregulation, anti-union measures that systematically reduced worker power and dramatically increased wage inequality in the U.S. and elsewhere.
The numbers are pretty stark. Michel notes that while productivity rose almost 70% between 1980 and 2020, hourly pay for a typical worker went up less than 12%.
While earnings for the top 1% just surged. The argument is that Friedman provided the intellectual justification for policies that fundamentally favored capital owners over labor.
Which brings us back full circle to the complexity of his legacy. A fierce defender of liberty and efficiency, but the real-world application of his blueprints produced results that many critics find problematic.
He shifted the debate, but the outcomes of that shift remain heavily contested.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? Friedman's impact is just undeniable. He permanently shifted the center of economic debate away from Keynesian fine-tuning to monetarist control and fiscal discipline. His works, especially Capitalism and Freedom, provided this accessible, detailed, and effective roadmap for classical liberalism.
And his enduring power really lies in his philosophical consistency. He could seamlessly go from a technical debate over the Phillips curve to radical advocacy for legalizing drugs or abolishing entire government departments. He just truly believed in maximum freedom and minimal state interference in every part of human life.
So our final thought for you to consider is this. Friedman's ultimate preference wasn't just for smaller government, but for a radically re-engineered, often automated state where human discretion was eliminated. He wanted rules, not rulers.
So considering his complex legacy, the rise in efficiency coupled with the concurrent rise in inequality, which of Friedman's most radical, automated, or decentralized proposals, things like the negative income tax or the K% rule, still holds the greatest potential today to fundamentally change policy and maximize both liberty and efficiency if implemented exactly as he intended.
The ultimate test of his philosophy remains whether automating the critical levers of government truly leads to the free and efficient society he envisioned.
Or whether it simply shifts power from bureaucrats to the unpredictable and often self-interested forces of the market. And that's a debate that continues to shape our world.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the mind and legacy of Milton Friedman.